Hello, my name's Aviva, and today I wanted to share with you some book recommendations that take place in New York City. I feel like the setting of a book is very important for the vibe of the story. Like sometimes you'll be reading a small town romance, and obviously that takes place in a small town, and therefore that very much gives off a vibe for the entire story because of where it's set. Sometimes you'll be reading about a book on vacation, and therefore maybe they're in Hawaii or on a tropical island or something along those lines, and obviously that gives off a very specific vibe for the entire story. And sometimes books are taking place in New York City specifically, and I personally am a really big fan of that because I am very familiar with the city. I've grown up my entire life right outside of the city. I've spent a lot of time in the city. Like growing up, we used to have like school field trips to the Metropolitan Museum. I've actually gone to school in the city at times. I've had internships and jobs in the city. I have friends that live in the city. I have family that lives in the city. I'm in the city all the freaking time, and I really like reading about when a book really captures the feeling of New York City specifically. And that is kind of why I decided I wanted to share with you some books that I think does this very well. The book is taking place in New York City, and not only is that just the setting of the book, but I really think that they capture the feeling of being in New York City very well. And that is why I have a lot of books that I wanted to share with you today. So first up, I have Mine Would Be You by Kay Janela. So this is actually a very recent read of mine. I just talked about this book in the last video that I had posted because I was making a vlog and this was the last book that I had read in that video. So I did talk about it a lot in that video. So in case you did watch that, I won't repeat myself too much here, but I will have it linked down below in case you haven't seen it and you want to hear a lot of details about what this book is about and what I thought about it and everything along those lines. But basically, this book is about this girl who is going to end up having a relationship with her ex-boyfriend's best friend. She basically had met him at a bar, didn't really know that he was best friends with her ex, and then they meet a couple of months later and she bumps into him at her ex's wedding where he's actually the best man, and that's when they reconnect, and then they start trying to give each other a shot and see if they can make this relationship work of sorts. So I thought that this was a really cute story, but one thing that I very much did like about it that I don't even think I had mentioned once in my previous video when I talked about this book was that it actually very much does take place in New York City. You're following this girl who she's grown up her entire life in the city. I believe she's originally from Brooklyn, and her parents still live in the house that she had grown up in, and throughout the book you kind of get to go and visit them a lot of times and see the neighborhood that she grew up in. But now she's living with her best friend. She's roommating with her best friend in New York City specifically because she has a job at a place like Vogue magazine. I think in this book it was called Pose magazine, but it was really like Vogue magazine, and either way she just writes articles for them. And throughout the story you kind of get to see a lot about her work and what it's like to be a young 20-year-old just trying to build up your career in the city. And then on top of that, this guy, he's a couple of years older than her, and he's actually a very well off, I think he was like a PR manager or something like that, but you basically get to see the other side of things where it's like when you're more successful in the city, you're a little bit more well established, you have a beautiful apartment, he even had a car in the city, he had a Hampton house that they actually went and visited one weekend, and basically you kind of just get the vibe of what it's like for two people who are living and working in the city to kind of try and date. Like at some points they went to this really tiny no-name pizza shop around the corner from her job, and they would get into taxis all the time and they would kind of just walk around the city, do city things, and I just really like the vibe of the general setting of this story. So if you have not read this book yet, I highly recommend giving it a shot. Next up, I have another recent read of mine, which is King of Wrath by Anna Hong. So this is an arranged marriage between two very elite New York City people. She is a jewelry heiress, socialite sort of girl, and he is one of the most eligible bachelors in their circle of sorts. And basically at the beginning of the book, her father actually blackmails this guy into an arranged marriage with his daughter, and she basically is just going to go along with it because she thinks that her father just found her a good match and she wants to make her father happy. She isn't aware that he was actually blackmailed into it, but he has to go along with it so that, the blackmail sort of thing. So basically he doesn't really want this marriage. She doesn't really want it either, but she's just going to try to make the best of it. They obviously very much do not get along at the beginning of the book, but slowly they're going to fall for each other anyway. And by the end of it, obviously they're going to want to get married even though they originally didn't. So this was a very, very good book. I honestly enjoyed it so much more than I expected to because I was not a fan of the previous books by Anna Hong. The entire Twisted series wasn't really up my alley, but this one I gave it a shot and I'm very happy that I did. So happens to be, this is a very elite New York City sort of vibe. You really get the vibe of what it's like to be in the socialite circle and what it's like to try and impress other people and have all of these wealthy friends and trying to just fit into society of sorts. And I really liked the vibe of that. I thought that it, even though it was a little bit is the word eccentric? I don't know if that's the right word, but either way, I thought it was a little bit over the top, but I do think that it really gave off the vibe. Well, I don't know if that's actually like how things really work, but I feel like stereotypically that is what you'd expect it to be. Like, you know, everybody judging each other, and it's like, oh, well, now that he is your fiance, you can get into all of these little events and like, you know, clubs and things that we never were going to let you in because you weren't old money, and like things along those lines. Like, it was very heavy New York City elite society sort of vibes. And if that is something that you really enjoy reading about, then I think that this is the perfect book for you. Next up, I have another recent read of mine, which is kind of more of like an all-time favorite because I recently reread it for the third time. So that is really saying something as to how much I absolutely love this book. But either way, that book is Vicious by L.J. Shen. So this is the first book in the Sinner of Saints companion series, and I have talked about it multiple times on my channel. But in case you have not heard me talk about it yet and you have not read this book yet, I will talk about it again. So this book is basically about these two people who had originally met when they were seniors in high school. This guy is very, very wealthy. He has like a very beautiful estate in California, and her parents just got hired to be the housekeepers for this estate. So she is going to be moving onto his property, and right away he does not like her. So he's actually going to spend the entire senior year of their high school, like the entire high school senior year, whatever it is you want to call it, he is going to be bullying the heck out of her. And it gets so bad to the point that by the end of that year, he's actually going to run her out of town and tell her that she can never come back. So now it's 10 years later and she's living in New York City just trying to get by. Like, she literally is like scraping for crumbs. She can hardly afford food, hardly afford rent, and she's just trying to get by. She has multiple jobs, and basically at the beginning of the book, like, he is going to walk into one of the bars that she's working at, and he's obviously going to be one of her customers. He's going to recognize who she is, and he actually needs something from her, so he is going to offer her a job, and it's a job that she cannot refuse because it is way more money than she'd ever make in any other job that she was able to get. And he's offering her like a lot of different incentives, and she basically cannot say no, even though she is well aware that he actually needs something from her. So she's going to take the job, and the rest of the story is going to be of them working together. I think she's like going to be his like personal assistant of sorts. And either way, that is more or less the gist of the story. But the big thing about this, as to why it's actually in this video, is because it does take place in New York City. And I really liked the vibe of this book in New York City specifically. Like, there are a lot of moments where we're hanging out in California, but then there are also a lot of moments where we're actually in New York City. And I really liked those moments a lot. Like, it very much gave off the vibe of what it's like to struggle in New York City, and then also what it's like to have way more money than you know what to do with living in New York City. And there was even one moment where like they went on this like day date in the city where they went to like Rockefeller Center, and then they went to like a Broadway show, they went to like a tattoo shop, and they just like walked around the city doing very like New York City sort of things. And I personally had a really great time with it. And one reason why I really love this book is because of the setting of the story. So obviously I like it for a lot of other reasons than that, but happens to be if you are a fan of books that do take place in New York City and you do like bully romances and you have not read this book yet, then I highly, highly recommend giving it a shot. So I really didn't do this on purpose, but I just realized that a lot of the books I'm talking about in today's video are actually like recent reads of mine, but that just says as to how much I really like the topic of today's video. I really like reading about books that take place in New York City. But either way, this next book is another one of those recent rereads of mine. Like, I'm pretty sure I originally read this book around this time last year, and then I recently did a reread of it like a month or two ago. But either way, that book is A Boss Man by V. Keeland. And just so you know, my reread went really well. Like, that is obviously why this book made it into this video. Like, it was just as good the second time around. So definitely highly recommend this one. But either way, this is one of those classic workplace environment books between a boss and an employee that obviously takes place in New York City. So at the beginning of this story, you basically meet, like, these two people end up meeting at a restaurant when they're on dates with different people. They have a very interesting first encounter, and then they kind of just like go their separate ways and forget about each other. And then they bump into each other like a couple more times throughout the city. Like, one time I think like randomly at a gym or just like walking on the street. I don't really remember, but either way, it's kind of like those when you just bump into random people, like when you're living in the city sort of thing. And then happens to be she needs a job, so she ends up getting hired at this company where who do you know is the boss? This guy. And then obviously he's already enamored with her. So once he realizes who his new employee is, he is going to heavily pursue her. And she doesn't really want to like start sleeping with the boss because she really likes this new job. She doesn't want to like make anything awkward or anything like that, but he doesn't want to take that for an answer. So he is just going to chase after her very heavily until she ends up giving in. And that is kind of more or less the gist of the story. So if you are a fan of workplace environment romances and you like when they're set in New York City and you have not read this book yet, I highly recommend giving it a shot. Next up, I have another book by V. Keeland for you, which is Hate Note. So this is another very classic workplace environment, New York City-based sort of romance. And I happen to think that this one gives off a little bit more of those New York City vibes than Boss Man does, but still same thing, same sort of vibe. Either way, in the beginning of this book, you're following this girl who has a very odd first encounter with the main guy in the story. He is like a real estate agent. He kind of like owns a very big real estate company, and I forgot how it ends up happening, but basically she ends up wanting to either get in this guy's presence, like see what he's all about, or check out the penthouse that he's like like in middle of checking out. I forgot the reasoning why behind it, but either way, she makes up this entire elaborate lie just so that she could get her foot in the door and get a showing by this man. And basically he completely sees right through her. Like, she obviously had to fill out like a questionnaire, and it was obviously completely a lie, but he decides to like go along with it anyway, just to see what's actually up. And obviously like she's going to like end up confronting her, and it's going to be extremely embarrassing, and she's kind of going to run away. And she goes downstairs and she ends up running into this like very old lady. She kind of like blabbers exactly what happened and how awkward it was and everything like that. And then this girl, like the old lady, ends up offering her a job, and then she's going to end up going to, you know, her new office, start her job. And who do you know is one of the owners of this company, as well as the grandson of this woman that gave her the job, the guy that she had that real estate showing thing with. So yeah, a lot of stuff going on there, but either way, it was a very funny like first encounter of how everything got itself set up. And then obviously now she's going to be working for him, and they're going to have to do some stuff together. Like, I'm pretty sure at one point he's going to have to do a showing in the Hamptons, and she's going to go along with him. So then it's going to end up being like a forced proximity situation, and there's just a lot of stuff going on, and you very much do get that like classic workplace environment New York City vibes. And then happens to be on top of that, it's a very like grumpy sunshine sort of situation. There's a lot of other things going on in like the background, but basically if you do like workplace environment romances and you do like when they're set in New York City and you haven't read this book yet, I definitely recommend giving it a shot, because I personally had a pretty solid time with it. Next up, I wanted to share Marriage for One by Eleanor Mess. So I'm specifically recommending the audiobook version of this because that is how I personally had listened to this book, and I very much enjoyed it in that format. And I've seen a lot of mixed reviews about this story in general. Like, I've seen a lot of people really like it, but then I've also seen a lot of very negative reviews about it. And that's kind of why I had pushed off this book for a very long time. And then I one time came across a review where someone said how they really didn't like reading it physically, but then they decided to give it a shot via audio, and they absolutely loved it that way. So that's kind of what made me decide to like listen to it via audio. I had found the audiobook on sale for like $2 at the time, so I decided to just go for it, and then I really ended up enjoying this book. So I can't vouch for the physical copy of this, but if you were down to listen to it via audio, I'd say that it was personally, like, I personally had a very great time with it. So with that disclaimer said, this is basically a marriage of convenience that does take place in New York City. You're basically following this girl who for the past couple of years has been working on getting this coffee shop opened. Like, her uncle owns this building in New York City, and he was going to give her the like, you know, bottom storefront or whatever so that she could open up her coffee shop. And then, you know, she was about to open up, and then one day her uncle dies, and in the will he basically said that like either the building can go to her brother or it can go to her husband if she is married. The thing is that she wasn't married, and if it had gone to her brother was not going to end up giving her the shop, and she just like poured her entire life savings into getting this coffee shop open. So she's like, oh my god, what the hell am I gonna do? And then happens to be the lawyer that's on the case of this will ends up offering to marry her, because whoever obviously marries her is going to end up inheriting the building. So he's like, look, I'll marry you, I'll take the building, and in exchange I will give you the coffee shop at the bottom, which is the only thing that you really want. So she's like, you know what, this is very weird, but I'm gonna take it, because literally like I don't know what I'm gonna do if I don't end up opening up this coffee shop. So that is exactly what ends up happening. They're gonna be in a marriage of convenience, they're gonna end up moving in together, pretending to be married, and she's just going to open up her coffee shop and like live her life. And the thing is that this book specifically gave me very like Dean and DeLuca vibes from Felicity. Like, I don't know if you have seen this show, but this is a show from probably like the 90s or so, and I personally am a really big fan of the show. Like, I've seen it like 1,000 times, and one thing that I absolutely love about this TV show specifically is the fact that this girl, even though she's like working, she goes to school in like NYU, but her job is to work at this coffee shop named Dean and DeLuca, and you get to spend a lot of time there. Like, it's a very big part of the TV show in general. And when I read this book, I just got such Dean and DeLuca vibes, and I absolutely loved it because of that. Like, you got to spend so much time with this girl just literally like running a coffee shop in New York City, and it was just a ton of fun. And then on top of that, you have this marriage of convenience, and happens to be it's kind of like a grumpy sunshine situation, so it's got a really good dynamic going for it. And all around the board, I personally had a really great time with this. I had a great time with the audio. So again, I'm not vouching for the physical copy, because I do know that a lot of people do not like reading it physically, but it's worth giving a shot physically. I don't know if it would actually be good or not that way, but if you were down to listen to it via audio, I recommend it. Next, I wanted to share with you this book called Darling Venom by Parker S. Huntington. So this is a book that you definitely should look into a little bit before you decide to like randomly go into, mostly because it is a little bit of a heavier story. Like, there are stuff like suicide and depression and things along those lines in this story. But if you are okay with that, then I think that this is a really, really great book. Like, I had a really fun time with this. So you're basically following this girl who, when she was in high school, she was very suicidal. And I think it was on Valentine's Day, she ends up going to the rooftop of her school, and she was prepared to, you know, do her thing. And when she's there, she ends up meeting somebody else who is actually prepared to do the same exact thing. And instead of doing what they were planning on doing, they're going to end up just talking and kind of becoming friends and making this deal that every single year at the same exact day, at the same exact time, they're going to meet on that rooftop and just check in on each other, make sure each other are doing fine. And then happens to be they end up doing this for a couple of years. And then one year the girl is late and the guy ends up doing what he always wanted to do. And that is kind of like the beginning of the story. And now it's a couple of years later, like you kind of spend like this amount of time going through that storyline. And then the rest of the book is like takes place, I think 4 years later or so, where this girl ends up running into this guy that she was friends with way back when, older brother. And he is now like a doctor in New York City of sorts. And she was dropping off something like in his office for like one of her bosses or something like that. I forgot what it is that she does, but basically she runs into the guy, she realizes who he is, and basically it's going to end up being their romance. So it's kind of like your first love's older brother sort of romance, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know, it's a weird situation, but basically it's going to end up being their thing. And they very much do not necessarily get along at the beginning of the book because, like, you know, they're both going through a lot of stuff, but that's kind of something that ends up making them connect because, like, she kind of feels really guilty for what happened and he feels really guilty for what happened for different reasons. And they're kind of going to connect with that, but also at the same time not really get along because I feel like they're both blaming each other. And there's just a lot of stuff going on in this book, and it's honestly very hard to explain, but it doesn't really matter because if it already sounds intriguing to you, then I definitely recommend just giving it a shot and going for it and seeing what it's all about for yourself. So with that said, this book actually does take place in New York City. Like at the beginning of the book, they're actually both going to private schools in New York City. And like, I remember her like taking the train a lot. Like I forgot if she lived in Brooklyn going to school in the city or something like that. But it's like, you get to spend a lot of time in the subway. And then he is a fancy doctor in New York City. And I'm pretty sure he like lives in a brownstone, or maybe like the original guy had lived in a brownstone. And like, I don't know, whatever it is, basically you very much do get the vibe of living in New York City. And I don't really remember the details because honestly, I did read this book a while ago, but I do remember that this book definitely does scream New York City setting. So if that does sound like it's something up your alley, I do recommend giving this book a shot after you do a little bit of, research for yourself. And the last book that I wanted to share with you for today's video is actually a book that doesn't necessarily take place in New York City, but it does have a very Manhattan feel to it. And that book is Manhattan by Candy Steiner. So this is the third book in the Becker Brothers companion series. And in this story you're following, I think he was the youngest Becker brother. It's like a family of 4 boys, and he is the youngest in the family, and his heart was recently broken. He had this high school girlfriend that broke his heart and moved on without him, and he does not know what to do with himself. And he decided that he wants to move away from his small town and start over in New York City, just because like there's too many memories following him around in this small town because he just keeps not being able to forget about his his ex-girlfriend of sorts. And throughout this story, you're going to end up meeting the girl that used to be best friends with him before this ex-girlfriend had come along. And now that the ex-girlfriend is out of the picture, she is coming back into his life, and she's going to try to remind him what is so great about living in their small town and how he doesn't have to leave just to get over his ex. And obviously slowly they're going to end up falling for each other. So it's kind of like a childhood best friends to not friends for a little bit to friends again to lovers sort of situation. And because of this idea in his head of like he really wants to move to New York City, you really get the vibe of what it's like for someone who does not live in New York City to want to move to New York City and why. And I don't really want to give away any spoilers about like what ends up happening throughout the story, but basically it does have a New York City theme to it, and that is why I wanted to add it into this video. So if you like small town romances but you also like the idea of New York City, then this will literally be the perfect book for you. So if you have not read it yet, I definitely recommend giving it a shot. And then before I do let you go, I did want to just quickly mention 2 other books that are very popular, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but because I'm talking about books that do take place in New York City, I wanted to just talk about these quickly because I am a very big fan of both of these books, and they both do take place in New York City, and that is the Percy Jackson series as well as the Mortal Instruments series. So both of these books are fantasy books, and this one is kind of like fantasy romance-ish, not really. It's kind of like a fantasy book that does have romances in it, but either way, both of these books do take place in New York City, and I feel like these are 2 of the OG books that I had fallen in love with that made me realize that I really like when books are set in New York City. So I'm not going to go into too much detail because like these are very popular. Most people have read them, but either way, if for some reason you have not read either one of these books and you really do like when books do take place in New York City and you are into fantasy, then these are 2 that I would definitely recommend checking it out because both of these give off such heavy New York City vibes. Like I could just sit here for 20 minutes and tell you every single reason why both of these books scream New York City's like setting for me, but I'm not going to do that because there's no point in it because most people have already read these books. But either way, just wanted to throw these in here at the end. So with that said, that is all I wanted to share with you today. So I hope that you found some good book recommendations in today's video. And if you have any recommendations for me of books that do take place in New York City that you really enjoyed, feel free to leave me a comment down below because I'm always looking for some good book recommendations. But either way, with that said, if you did have a fun time today, then please give this video a like, subscribe to my channel if you are not currently subscribed. And either way, thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video because I really do appreciate it. And until next time, enjoy reading.